Hi, welcome back to Josh Eats, and today we have a very special guest, Professor Eric Silver. If you want to introduce yourself just a little bit.
Yes, I'm Eric Silver. I'm a professor of sociology and criminology at Penn State University, and I teach a course called Knowing Right from Wrong, which is where I met Josh.
Yeah, and today for our food we have cookies.
Cookies. Awesome.
So everyone loves cookies, so today we got some cookies.
Yeah.
And feel free to take a cookie whenever you like.
Okay.
And so for our first question, we're going to start off way back when. So you mentioned a lot in the class that you grew up in Brooklyn, and I take it you've probably visited sometime recently. Or so how do you think Brooklyn has changed from when you were growing up there?
Well, it's changed dramatically. I grew up in Brooklyn in the 1970s, and the last time I was back in Brooklyn was a few months ago with my daughter and grandchild and son-in-law and wife, and we went back to a diner where I used to hang out and eat as a teenager, right across the street from my high school, which was South Shore High School. So I grew up in the Flatbush part of Brooklyn. And so the dramatic changes are, well, a lot of it has to do with poverty and race. The areas that I grew up in are now much poorer than they were in the past, and racially and ethnically they're much more Black and Hispanic. When I grew up, there was Black and Hispanic, but there was also a lot of Italian, Jewish, and Irish, so the composition has changed since then too. Yeah,
because I've always liked Brooklyn because I have family that lives there too. They live in the Bensonhurst area. Bensonhurst.
Yeah.
The Chinatown, 8th Ave, and
yeah.
Over, I think it was 2 summers ago, I worked at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. I don't know if you're familiar with that hospital.
I've heard of it.
It's in like the Prospect Park area. So I've always liked Brooklyn, and I thought it was really interesting that you said you're from Brooklyn. So now for our next question. So now there are a lot of like movies and like Batman, the Joker is a more recent one. They take place in Gotham City, which is like a made up like New York City type city. And especially at the end of the Joker, there was a large like riot. So now, do you think it's ever possible for something like Purge to take place in New York?
Right. So do I think something like that could happen? Should happen?
Not should happen.
Okay.
Could happen one day.
When I think of things like that, I think of sort of post-apocalyptic images come to mind where law and order has totally broken down. And I do think under those conditions you would have a lot of bad behavior. There would be a lot of rioting or looting, probably more than rioting. People generally want things that they can use more than they want to hurt other people. But I also think there'd be a lot of good behavior, and there'd be a lot of people joining together to enforce rules and to keep each other from doing bad things. And I think those instincts would be there as well. So I don't think it would be the kind of mayhem that doomsday sayers would predict.
Okay,
it'd be more mixed.
And for this next segment, we're going to be talking about a little bit about your research. Can you just explain some of your research and some of the work that you're very proud of?
Yeah, I am currently working on research that I think is the best I've done in my career. So I've been at this for 25 years now, and I started off studying mental disorder and violence. And I extended that area with a concern for victimization, and found that people with mental illnesses are not only more likely to be violent, but they're also more likely to be victimized violently. So that work is a big part of my past. Nowadays, I'm focused on morality, which is a big part of the class that I'm teaching, that you've been in. And stuff that I'm most interested in and proud of these days is finding that morality makes a difference in some really important behaviors. So we have found that people's morality influences their willingness to stigmatize other people. And interestingly, the more moral you are, the more likely you are to stigmatize others, because the more moral you are, the more the more of a boundary you have around what's right and wrong, and the more you might feel negatively towards those who break it. People's morality influences their willingness to misbehave, engage in crime and delinquency. We're working on a study right now showing that people's morality influences their likelihood of committing suicide. And so documenting this, how morality works and how it affects people's behavior, to me is interesting. It's also relatively new in the fields that I work in.
And now, have any of your research projects ever helped influence any sort of like policy changes?
Yeah, the closest I came there was I had a paper that was cited by the United States Supreme Court, and it was a paper on the insanity defense. And what it did was it compared people's perceptions of how often the insanity defense is used and how likely the defendants are to get off scot-free. I compared that to the actual data of how often it's used and how likely people are to get off scot-free. And we found that the general public grossly overestimates how much it's used and how much people avoid punishment using it. And that study happened to be published as the United States Supreme Court was hearing a case about jury instruction and whether juries should be told the likelihood that a mentally ill person will go to a mental hospital if they're acquitted versus prison if they're not. And that was, a technical legal thing, but the Supreme Court had to weigh in on it. The study came out, and so it informed the court's decision. That was the first study that I ever published, so it's been all downhill since then.
Nowadays, there are a lot of TV shows about committing crimes, things like that. There's two very interesting TV shows that I watched recently. One of them is called Mindhunters, and another one is called Escape at Dannemora. Now, a lot of those TV shows that are like based on real life, do you think that they're more informative or that they're more for entertainment purposes?
I have seen a few episodes of Mindhunters. I haven't seen the other show, and I was impressed by how much of what researchers do the show had absorbed, and surprised by that. I don't think I'd seen that before. So if a show like that, and if these shows are similar, are any indication of what's happening and what's coming, it may be that the writers of these shows are being more judicious about the kinds of plot lines and the kinds of details they're putting into the shows to make them more realistic.
So now another thing is, you mentioned that you like to ride your motorcycle. How did you get into that?
That I would have gotten into early in my life, except my mother forbid it. So when I was a late teenager, I wanted a motorcycle, and she basically said, "Over my dead body." So that plan got put on hold until I was, 2007. I was almost 40 years old, and that's when I went and got the license and then got the motorcycle, and then I became captivated with that. I mean, you might actually see a little pattern here. I get very captivated and obsessed with things and with interests and hobbies, and so motorcycling became it for a few years. So I went on a lot of overnight trips. The most dramatic was, have you read the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Oh, read it at some point in your life. You won't regret it. But the book, the main character rides his motorcycle, I forget where he starts off from, but cross-country to Bozeman, Montana. So I decided that I had to do the same thing. So I went out on my motorcycle alone, the same way I run, and using only back roads. I took a week and just rode all the way to Montana. And it was, again, very dramatic, endurance kind of activity that it's a great memory and one that I'm so glad I did.
So you grew up in Brooklyn, and now you're here in State College, which I would say is a very big contrast. So how was the transition to moving to a place like State College?
Well, I lived in Albany, New York in between. Maybe it's because I grew up in Brooklyn and because I grew up in a context with a lot of crime, a lot of chaos, a fairly chaotic family background as well. And maybe because of that, I love the peace of a small town. So I love the fact that there's almost no traffic in this town, except on football Saturdays. But there's almost no traffic. You can leave your car unlocked without worry. If you forget to lock your front door of your house, you don't have to go running back. So the calm and the peace, I think, after having grown up in a place that was had a lot of crime and a lot of tension and stress and conflict, is just what I need. So I love visiting the city, both Brooklyn and Manhattan. But after not too long, a day of that, and I'm ready to get back.
Welcome back to Weirdest Ever, a show where you answer questions about the weirdest ever moments in the classroom.
So now we're gonna start on a new segment of our show that we've never done before. It's called Weirdest Ever. So now the first question is, what is the weirdest ever email you think you've received?
That's a good one. Well, I think the weirdest ever email was also an excuse for missing class. So this was a student emailed me to tell me that he had been abducted by aliens, and he had a long description of the experience and assured me that he had looked up the experiences of others and his matched it. He lost some time, he had some bruise he couldn't explain, he woke up in a room that he didn't fall asleep in. Interestingly, the same symptoms of too much partying, what it sounded like to me, but anyway, he seemed fairly convinced that when I saw him in class the next day, he seemed very convinced. So that stands out as something that was very, very, very odd, and yet there was no way for me to convince this student that it didn't happen. And so there it was.
Was this student like a theater major or anything?
I don't know what the major was, but it was the class was on deviant behavior. So we've been talking about a lot of deviant behaviors. And earlier in the class, the topic of alien abduction had come up, and so it could be suggestibility or something like that, which happens to people. I mean, they never hear of certain things, and then you give them a list of symptoms of the experience, and suddenly, you can see yourself in it.
That's why I hear a lot of med students feel like they have like every disease out there.
I bet, right? Every disease you learn about. Yeah.
So now, the next weirdest ever question is, what is the weirdest way you've ever, maybe not caught, but seen someone try to cheat in your class?
I've seen the standard types of, people looking at each other's papers, but one of the interesting ones that happened was we found two exams that were handed in where it was clear that the answers were copied from one to the other. But the pencils were different, the handwriting looked a little different. So when I brought the two students in, it turned out they were brother and sister. And it also turned out that the brother, number one, had no idea, because as far as he was concerned, he was absent that day of the test. So the sister, in order to do a good deed for her brother, filled in two tests with different pens somehow and handed them both in, and then got caught. I felt kind of like, all right, good sister, but come on, really?
Yeah,
and then don't tell him about it, So he found out when he got called in, and so that was just an odd situation to deal with.
Yeah, no academic.
Right. No, it's it's a real issue. If you got siblings, that bond of loyalty, which we've talked about in the class, is so powerful. And loyalty to me is one of those things that feels moral, but if there's any moral principle that will lead you to do things that are you'll regret, it's loyalty. And so, having siblings in the same class is a bad idea. My kids went to Penn State, and my daughter wanted to sign up for my deviance class. The class is 200 students. And I so wanted her to on one level, but I also just knew it was a bad idea, and that it would be impossible to grade her fairly, and so we talked about it, and we both decided it was just not going to work.
So now, for the next question, we have what's the weirdest outfit that a student has come into class with?
Oh yeah, well there was a student that I won't mention his name, but who I was pretty fond of. He came to to class in a gorilla suit, and it wasn't Halloween. And it was a thing. He had this gorilla suit. He was in the ROTC and very determined to become a Navy SEAL, and hung out with a bunch of other students who were in that group. But his every once in a while he would put on this gorilla suit and he would terrorize his friends. He would hide in bushes. He would lurk behind places, and he would just jump out and attack them wearing the gorilla suit. To the point where they most of his friends became, a little bit paranoid. They're kind of glancing around, making sure there's no gorillas waiting to attack. And that was his thing. He had the gorilla suit. So that's probably the weirdest one.
Okay. So now we're coming sort of towards the end of this talk. So now I just have a few final questions. First, how does it feel you said that you published with your daughter a research paper, and that's probably an experience that a lot of people don't have. How did that feel?
That's amazing. I mean, you can imagine the kinds of things that I'm interested in studying, that our dinner conversations when she and my son were young were, there was a lot of leakage of these kinds of topics. And so, but I never thought that we'd end up, number one, that she'd end up a professor, and number two, that we'd end up studying together. And then she had several different majors as an undergrad, so it wasn't even clear when she started college that it would happen. But eventually decided that this kind of work was what she wanted to do. It's given my work a meaningfulness that I never thought was possible. We call it the family business, but doing the work, writing the papers, coming up with the ideas, going back and forth together on stuff that we're doing, right at this moment, has made work, a lot more meaningful. I now have a good sense of, people who are in family businesses and how interesting that must be.
So now the last question, it's a fitting question to finish this out. So we're at Penn State right now, and it's possible that the people who watch this are going to be college students. What is some college advice that you would give to any college student that you think is the most important thing that they either do or try to get out of college?
Well, let's see. College is the beginning. You're developing habits and approaches that will stay with you for a while afterwards. I think learning to be disciplined, just taking charge of your own time and your own energy and focus, because it's hard to know this when you're young, but it's finite. You don't get, endless amounts of those things. And making good use of them and learning to do that early is probably your best bet to getting wherever it is that you want to ultimately go.
So some other people I've talked to have said that college is the last time in your life that you'll be able to be undisciplined, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
How would you try to compromise being disciplined with the last chance you have to engage in a non-professional?
Right. Yeah. So it's your chance to make a lot of have fun and make a lot of mistakes in a relatively safe environment. And sure, you definitely want to do that. But I think that gets exaggerated. We live in a society that's very pleasure-oriented and very, individual focused and narcissistic and all of that. And I think that you can use the college years as an excuse to do all kinds of things that are not going to better you as a person and not going to make you feel like you're developing into the being you want to become. So, you got to be careful about that. There's a lot of pressure, peer pressure, or, some informal pressure to compromise yourself. And we all know when we've done it, and you can do it under the banner of these are my college years, but I don't think it makes you a better person in the end.
Okay, so thank you very much for taking the time, and like, comment, and subscribe, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you, Josh.
Nope.
Bye, everybody.